The woman stood at the edge of the forest with dirt under her fingernails and a rabbit already gutted at her feet. And when the cowboy rode up on his half-starved mare, she knew immediately that he was the kind of man who would die out here without someone like her. His name was Harrison Sloane, though she would not learn that for another hour, and hers was Georgia Pratt, 22 years old in the spring of 1882, with knowledge passed down from her grandmother about which roots would not kill you and which berries made your stomach stop cramping when the hunger got bad. He was 25, lean as a whip from too many days with nothing but hardtack and coffee, his brown eyes hollow in a way that spoke of genuine suffering rather than mere discomfort. "You look like you have not eaten anything worth eating in a month," she said, not bothering with pleasantries because out here in the Texas wilderness pleasantries got you nowhere. Harrison dismounted slowly, his legs uncertain beneath him. "Closer to 6 weeks, if I am being honest. Lost my supplies in a river crossing. Been living on what I can shoot, but ammunition does not grow on trees. Neither does food, but it is out there if you know where to look." She gestured at the forest behind her, dense with juniper and oak, the kind of scrubland that looked barren to anyone who had not been taught properly. "I am headed toward Terlingua with goods to trade. You can come along if you want. I do not let people starve." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her practical wool skirt, the leather satchel across her shoulder, the knife at her belt that looked well used and well maintained. She was pretty in an unconventional way, with dark blonde hair braided down her back and freckles across her nose, but it was her confidence that struck him most. She moved like someone who belonged out here, who understood the land in a way he had never managed despite 3 years of trying to make a life in Texas. "I would appreciate that more than you know," he said quietly. "What do I owe you? Help me carry things and do not complain." "That is payment enough." They started walking, his horse trailing behind them, and within 20 minutes Georgia had stopped 3 times to gather food. First, she dug up wild onions, their sharp scent filling the air as she brushed dirt from the white bulbs. Then she found a patch of agarita berries, red and tart, and filled a small cloth bag with them. Finally, she knelt beside a prickly pear cactus and carefully removed several petals, wrapping them in another cloth to avoid the spines. "We will eat well tonight," she said, and there was satisfaction in her voice that made Harrison feel something he had not felt in a long time: hope. They made camp as the sun began to set, the sky turning orange and purple over the rough Texas landscape. Georgia built the fire with practiced efficiency while Harrison tended to his horse, making sure the animal had water from his canteen. When he returned to the fire, she already had the rabbit roasting on a spit, the wild onions buried in the coals to soften, and the cactus petals laid out on a flat stone she had heated in the flames. "How did you learn all this?" he asked, settling down across from her. "My grandmother was half Lipan Apache. She married a white man, my grandfather, but she never forgot where she came from. She taught my mother, and my mother taught me." Georgia turned the rabbit, watching the fat drip and sizzle in the fire. "Most of what I know comes from her people. The rest I figured out myself through trial and error. Made myself sick more than once eating the wrong thing, but that is how you learn what to avoid. Where is your family now?" Her face tightened slightly. "Gone. Cholera took my parents 4 years ago. My grandmother passed the winter before that. I have been on my own since. I am sorry. Do not be. They taught me how to survive, which is more than most people get." She pulled one of the wild onions from the coals, testing it with her knife before nodding in satisfaction. "This is ready." The rabbit needs another few minutes. When they finally ate, Harrison thought it might be the best meal he had ever had, though he knew that was probably the hunger talking. Still, There was something about the way Georgia had prepared everything, the care she had taken with ingredients most people would not even recognize as food, that made it special. The rabbit was tender and flavorful, the onions sweet and soft, the cactus paddles surprisingly good with a slightly tangy taste that complemented the meat. "You have a gift," he said after his third helping. "I mean that sincerely." She looked pleased despite herself. "It is just knowledge and practice. Anyone could do it if they took the time to learn. But most people do not. Most people would walk right past everything you gathered today and never know they were surrounded by food." He set down his plate, suddenly serious. "Where did you say you were headed?" "Terlingua. There is a trading post there, and the mine brings in enough people that I can sell what I gather. Medicinal herbs, mostly, but also honey when I can find it, and preserved foods for travelers who do not want to carry heavy supplies. That is still 2 days' walk from here. 3, the way I go. I do not take the direct route because the direct route does not have the best foraging." She began cleaning the dishes with sand, her movements efficient. "Why? Where are you headed?" "Nowhere in particular. I have been drifting since my cattle operation failed. Bought into a herd with 2 other men, but we lost most of the animals to drought and the rest to rustlers. Been trying to figure out what to do next." "You could come with me to Terlingua," she said, not looking at him. "I could use someone who knows how to handle a gun, and you could use regular meals. Seems like a fair trade." Harrison considered this. He had been alone for so long, moving from town to town looking for work, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections. The idea of traveling with someone, especially someone as capable as Georgia, was appealing in a way that surprised him. "I would like that," he said finally, "if you are sure you do not mind the company. I would not have offered if I minded." She finally looked at him, and in the firelight her eyes were warm. "Besides, it gets lonely out here sometimes. Having someone to talk to will be nice." They fell into an easy rhythm over the next 3 days. Each morning Georgia would wake before dawn and scout the area around their camp, returning with whatever she had found. Wild turkey eggs, pecans from a tree growing near a dried creek bed, mesquite beans that she ground into flour using 2 rocks. Harrison learned to recognize the plants she favored, though he knew it would take years to develop her instinctive understanding of the land. He made himself useful in other ways, maintaining their equipment, keeping watch at night, using his rifle to bring down a deer on the second day that provided them with enough meat for several meals. They talked as they walked, sharing stories of their lives. Harrison told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had died when Harrison was 16, forcing him to become a man faster than he would have liked. He had come to Texas looking for opportunity, believing the stories about fortunes to be made in cattle. The reality had been much harsher than the stories suggested. Georgia spoke of her childhood moving between towns, her father working as a blacksmith while her mother sold remedies and tonics made from the plants Georgia helped gather. It had been a hard life, but not an unhappy one, and she clearly missed her family terribly, even if she tried to hide it. On the 3rd night, with Terlingua less than a day away, they camped beside a spring that Georgia knew about, a hidden spot surrounded by cottonwood trees where the water ran clear and cold. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Harrison found himself watching her in the flickering light, noticing things he had been too hungry and tired to notice before. The graceful way she moved her hands when she talked, the brightness of her laugh when he said something amusing, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. "What are you staring at?" she asked, catching him looking. "You," he admitted, because he had never been good at deception. "I was thinking that I am glad my supplies fell in that river. If they had not, I never would have met you." She went still, her expression unreadable. "Harrison." I know we have only known each other a few days, he continued, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. But I feel different around you, like I can breathe properly for the first time in years, like I am not just surviving but actually living. I feel it too, she said softly. I did not want to say anything because I thought maybe it was just me, or maybe it was just because we have been traveling together and it would fade once we reached town. Do you think it will fade? No. She met his eyes steadily. No, I do not think it will. He moved around the fire to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the night alive with the sound of insects and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Then Georgia turned her head and Harrison kissed her, gentle at first and then with increasing passion as she responded, her hand coming up to cup the back of his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. I have not felt this way about anyone before, she whispered. Neither have I. He stroked her hair, marveling at the softness of it. What do we do now? We keep going to Terlingua like we planned. I have to deliver my goods, but after that. She pulled back to look at him. After that, maybe we figure out what comes next together instead of separately. I would like that very much. They held each other as the fire burned down to embers, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Harrison felt like he had found something worth holding on to. Terlingua was a rough mining town. All dust and adobe buildings clustered around the cinnabar mines that had brought people to this harsh corner of Texas. The population swelled and shrank with the fortunes of the mines, and when Georgia and Harrison arrived in the late afternoon of the fourth day, the town was in one of its busy periods. Men covered in red dust from the mercury mines filled the streets, their wages burning holes in their pockets, looking for food and drink and entertainment. Georgia led Harrison to the trading post, a low building run by a Mexican family named Herrera. The proprietor, Señor Herrera, greeted Georgia warmly, clearly familiar with her. Señorita Pratt, we have been waiting for you. My wife, she is almost out of the salve you make for burns. Half the miners in town have been asking about it. I brought plenty, Georgia assured him, setting down her pack. And I have other things too. Let me show you. Harrison watched as she negotiated, impressed by her business sense. She knew exactly what her goods were worth and refused to be lowballed, but she was also fair, understanding that Señor Herrera had to make a profit too. They settled on prices for her herbs, her honey, her preserved foods, and the salve that was apparently in such high demand. When they were done, Georgia had enough money to keep her supplied for months. You need a place to stay, Señor Herrera asked, counting out coins. My cousin has rooms to rent, clean, cheap, better than the boarding house near the mines. That would be perfect, Georgia said, for 2 people. Señor Herrera glanced at Harrison, his expression neutral but his eyes knowing. I will tell her to expect you. The room was small but clean, with a real bed instead of a bedroll on the ground and a window that looked out over the scrubby desert. There was a wash basin with actual soap, a luxury after days on the trail, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes and equipment. We should talk about what happens next, Georgia said once they had settled in. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking uncertain. I usually stay in Terlingua for a week or 2, selling goods and gathering information about what people need, and then I head back out to collect more. But that was when I was alone. Now that you are here, we should decide together what we want to do. Harrison pulled up the room's single chair and sat facing her. What do you want to do? Honestly. I want to keep doing what I have been doing, but with you, traveling through the wilderness, gathering what the land provides, bringing it back to sell. It is a good life, Harrison. Not easy, but good. I feel free out there in a way I never feel in towns. "Then that is what we will do," he said simply. "I will learn what you can teach me about foraging and plants. I can hunt and protect us if trouble comes. We will be partners." "Partners," she repeated, and then smiled. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He reached out and took her hand. "Georgia, I know this is fast. I know we should probably take more time and be sensible about things, but I do not want to be sensible. I want to be with you, whatever that looks like." She squeezed his hand. "I want that too. But Harrison, you need to understand what you are signing up for. This life is hard. There will be times when we are cold and hungry despite my skills. There will be danger from animals and from people. It is not romantic adventures all the time. I know that. I have been out here long enough to understand what the West really is." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "But I also know that doing it alone is harder than doing it with someone you care about. And I do care about you, Georgia. More than I have cared about anyone in a long time." She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and sweet, and when she pulled back her eyes were bright with emotion. "Then we will do this together. Partners in everything." "Partners in everything," he agreed. They spent the next week in Terlingua, but they were not idle. Harrison found work helping to repair a stable, earning money they would need for supplies. Georgia sold her goods and gathered information, talking to miners and travelers about what routes were safe, where water could be found, what plants were growing well this season. In the evenings, they would return to their small room and share a meal, talking about their plans, learning more about each other with every conversation. Harrison discovered that Georgia loved music, but had never learned to play an instrument. She discovered that he could whittle intricate figures from wood, a skill his father had taught him during long Missouri winters. He made her a small bird, perfectly detailed, and she carried it in her pocket like a talisman. On their 6th night in Terlingua, they made love for the first time, and it felt like the natural progression of everything that had been building between them since that first day in the forest. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Georgia traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "I never thought I would find this," she murmured. "I thought I would be alone forever, and I had made peace with that. And then you showed up, half-starved and desperate, and everything changed." "Best river crossing I ever made," Harrison said, making her laugh. He turned serious, tilting her face up so he could look into her eyes. "I love you, Georgia Pratt. I know it is fast and probably foolish, but it is true all the same." "It is not foolish." She kissed him softly. "And I love you too, Harrison Sloane. I think I have loved you since you trusted me enough to follow me into the wilderness even though you did not know me at all." They left Terlingua 2 days later, their packs heavy with supplies and their hearts light with purpose. The plan was to head north through the Chihuahuan Desert, taking a route that Georgia knew would offer good foraging despite the harsh landscape. They would gather as they went, preserve what they could, and then loop back to Terlingua or another town to sell their goods before heading out again. It was a hard life, just as Georgia had warned, but it was also deeply satisfying. Harrison learned quickly, his natural intelligence and willingness to learn making him an apt student. Georgia taught him to identify dozens of edible plants, the broad leaves of amaranth that could be cooked like spinach, the roots of cattails that tasted almost like potatoes, the flowers of yucca that could be eaten raw or roasted. She showed him how to find water in seemingly dry creek beds by digging in certain spots, how to read the behavior of birds and animals to locate food sources, how to preserve meat using salt and smoke so it would last for weeks. In return, Harrison taught her things he knew: how to read the weather by the shape of clouds, how to tell the quality of leather by touch, how to maintain firearms so they would not jam at critical moments. He was a good shot and provided them with fresh game regularly, but he also learned to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of gathering food the way Georgia did, using knowledge and observation rather than violence. They traveled through some of the most beautiful and brutal landscape Texas had to offer. They crossed desert badlands where the heat was so intense that they had to travel in the early morning and late evening, resting during the day in whatever shade they could find. They climbed into mountains where pine trees grew and the air turned cool and sweet. They followed rivers through canyons where the walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, and the water ran clear over stones worn smooth by centuries of flow. Everywhere they went, Georgia found food. She had an almost supernatural ability to look at a landscape and know what it would offer, to recognize plants that others would dismiss as weeds, to understand the relationships between different species and how to use that knowledge to their advantage. Harrison never went hungry on their journeys, and neither did Georgia. They ate well, varied meals that would have surprised anyone who thought the wilderness was a barren place. They also faced dangers together. Once, they encountered a group of men who clearly had bad intentions, but Harrison's rifle and Georgia's fierce demeanor convinced them to move along without trouble. Another time, they were caught in a flash flood and had to scramble up a hillside, abandoning some of their supplies but keeping their lives. Through it all, they relied on each other, their partnership growing stronger with every challenge they faced and overcame. Months passed in this way, turning into a year and then more. They returned to Terlingua periodically, but they also discovered other towns and trading posts, building a network of customers who valued Georgia's knowledge and the quality of her goods. They saved their money carefully, and eventually Harrison brought up an idea he had been considering. "What if we bought some land?" he asked one evening as they camped near a spring-fed pool. "Nothing fancy, just enough for a small house and a garden. Somewhere we could use as a base instead of constantly traveling." Georgia looked thoughtful. "Where would we buy it?" "I was thinking somewhere between here and the mountains, a place with good access to foraging grounds but also with enough water to grow things. We could still travel for part of the year, but we would have a home to come back to." "A home," she repeated softly, and he could see the longing in her face. As much as she loved the traveling life, he knew part of her missed having a place that was truly hers. "I think I would like that. But it has to be the right place, somewhere that feels right to both of us. Then we will keep looking until we find it." They found it 6 months later in the summer of 1884. It was a small valley tucked into the foothills of the Davis Mountains, with a creek that ran year-round and oak trees that provided shade. There was already a crude cabin on the property, built by someone who had given up and moved on, and the land was available for a price they could afford with their savings. They bought it from a land agent in Fort Davis, signing the papers that made them official property owners. Then they spent the next several months fixing up the cabin, expanding it from 1 room to 3, building a proper kitchen and a porch where they could sit in the evenings. Georgia planted a garden with vegetables and herbs, using her knowledge to create a space that would provide them with food and medicine. Harrison built a small barn for the 2 horses they now owned, and a chicken coop that quickly filled with laying hens. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way that their travels had never quite been. This was theirs, a permanent mark they were making on the land, a declaration that they belonged here together. On a warm evening in September, with the garden flourishing and the cabin complete, Harrison and Georgia stood on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. His arm was around her waist, and she leaned into him, perfectly content. "I have been thinking," he said quietly. About what? About the fact that we have been together for more than 2 years now, and I have never properly asked you to marry me. She turned in his arms, surprised. I thought we already were married in all the ways that matter. We are, he agreed, but I want to make it official. I want to stand up in front of a preacher and promise you forever, and have the law recognize you as my wife. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours. Harrison Sloane, are you proposing to me? I am. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple gold with a small stone that caught the fading light. I bought this in Fort Davis last time we went for supplies. I have been carrying it around for a month trying to figure out the perfect way to ask you. But I think this is perfect enough. Just you and me and the land we built our life on. Georgia's eyes filled with tears. Yes. Yes, of course I will marry you. I would have said yes 2 years ago if you had asked. I would have said yes that first night by the fire. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. They were married a month later in Fort Davis, with Senor Herrera and his wife traveling up from Terlingua to serve as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony in a small church, but it felt momentous all the same. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed Georgia with such enthusiasm that the few people in attendance laughed and applauded. That night, in the hotel room they had rented for their wedding night, Georgia lay in her husband's arms and felt more complete than she had ever thought possible. "What do you think comes next?" she asked, tracing the ring on her finger. "Whatever we want," Harrison said. "We have the land, we have each other, we have skills that will keep us fed and housed. The rest is up to us." "I want children," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "Someday, I want to teach them what my grandmother taught me. I want to give them the kind of childhood I had growing up close to the land. I want that too." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We will have a good life, Georgia. I promise you that." And they did. The years that followed were not easy, because life in Texas in the 1880s was never easy, but they were good years. They continued to travel periodically, gathering plants and hunting, but they always came home to their valley and their cabin. Georgia became known throughout the region for her knowledge of medicinal plants, and people would travel for days to consult with her about ailments that doctors could not fix. Harrison built a reputation as a fair and skilled craftsman, able to repair anything and build furniture that would last for generations. In the spring of 1886, Georgia gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Henry after Harrison's father. He was strong and healthy, with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Harrison held his son with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility and love. "He is perfect," Georgia whispered from the bed, exhausted but happy. "He is absolutely perfect." "He is," Harrison agreed, unable to look away from the tiny face. "And we are going to give him everything we can." They did. Henry grew up surrounded by love and knowledge, learning to ride before he could properly walk, learning to identify plants while other children his age were still learning their letters. Georgia taught him everything she knew, taking him on long walks through the wilderness and showing him the secrets of the land. Harrison taught him to shoot and ride and work with his hands, passing down the skills his own father had taught him. 2 years after Henry was born, they had a daughter they named Grace. She was fierce from the moment she entered the world, crying with impressive volume and refusing to be soothed by anyone except her mother. As she grew, it became clear that she had inherited Georgia's gift for understanding the land, able to spot edible plants with an accuracy that surprised even her mother. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The children grew, the garden flourished, the little homestead became a true home. Harrison and Georgia still took trips into the wilderness, sometimes with the children and sometimes just the two of them, but they always came back to the valley. It was their anchor, the place where they belonged. On a cool evening in November of 1891, nearly a decade after they had first met, Harrison and Georgia sat on their porch watching Henry and Grace play in the yard. Henry was trying to teach his little sister how to whittle, with mixed results and much laughter. "You remember when we met?" Georgia asked, reaching for Harrison's hand. "Every detail," he said, lacing their fingers together. "You were standing at the edge of the forest with a rabbit at your feet, and I thought you were the most capable person I had ever seen. You were half-starved and desperate." "I was," he agreed. "And you saved my life, not just that day, but every day since. You taught me how to really live, Georgia, how to understand the land and work with it instead of fighting against it." "We saved each other," she corrected. "I was so lonely before you came along. I had convinced myself that I did not need anyone, but I was wrong. I needed you. I still need you. And I need you." He lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles, the same gesture he had made years ago in Terlingua. "I love you, Georgia Sloane. I love the life we built together. I love our children and our home and every single moment we have shared." "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you so much it still surprises me sometimes. After all these years, I still look at you and think about how lucky I am." They sat together as the sun set, watching their children play, and Harrison thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had been lost and hungry and alone, drifting through Texas with no purpose and no hope. And then Georgia had appeared, like a miracle, showing him that the wilderness was not a hostile place to be survived, but a generous provider if you knew how to listen. She had taught him to find food in any forest, to read the land like a book, to understand the intricate relationships between plants and animals and weather. She had taught him that he never had to go hungry on their journeys, because abundance was everywhere if you had the knowledge to recognize it. But more than that, she had taught him about love and partnership, and what it meant to build a life with someone. The children eventually tired of their game and came running up to the porch, demanding stories and attention. Harrison scooped up Grace while Georgia pulled Henry into her lap, and they spent the next hour telling stories about their travels, about the places they had been, and the things they had seen. The children listened with rapt attention, already dreaming of the adventures they would have when they were old enough to travel on their own. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Harrison and Georgia stood in their bedroom and held each other close. "Thank you," Harrison whispered into her hair. "For what? For everything. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this life." "You gave me the same things," she pointed out. "We did this together, Harrison. Everything we have we built together, I know, but I still want to thank you." He pulled back to look at her face, memorizing features he already knew by heart. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and I am grateful every single day that I crossed that river and lost my supplies and ended up half-starved and desperate exactly where you would find me." She laughed, the sound warm and full of joy. "Fate, you think? I do not know about fate, but I know that meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, knowing exactly how to touch each other, how to give and receive pleasure. Afterward, curled together in the darkness, Georgia thought about the path her life had taken. She had expected to be alone forever, traveling the wilderness with only her knowledge and skills for company. She had made peace with that future, believing it was enough. And then Harrison had appeared, changing everything. He had trusted her enough to follow her into the wilderness. He had been willing to learn from her, to value her knowledge, to see her as an equal partner rather than someone to be protected or controlled. He had loved her for exactly who she was, never trying to change her or tame her or make her fit into some conventional mold. Together they had built something remarkable, a life that honored both the wilderness and the home, that balanced adventure with stability, that celebrated knowledge and skill and partnership. They had created a family, passing down traditions and wisdom to the next generation. They had found abundance in a land that many considered barren, and they had found love in a time and place where survival often seemed hard enough without the luxury of romance. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and harvests and the steady growth of their children. Henry grew tall and strong, eventually leaving home to work as a guide for settlers heading further west, using the knowledge his parents had given him to help others survive the journey. Grace stayed closer to home, marrying a young man from Fort Davis and settling on land adjacent to her parents' homestead, continuing her mother's work with medicinal plants. Harrison and Georgia grew older together, their bodies wearing down from years of hard work but their spirits remaining strong. They still took trips into the wilderness, though not as frequently or as far as they once had. But Georgia's knowledge never faded, and even in her 70s, she could look at a landscape and know exactly what it offered, exactly how to survive and even thrive there. On a spring morning in 1912, 30 years after they had first met, Harrison and Georgia walked hand in hand through the forest near their home. Georgia pointed out plants to him, naming them and explaining their uses, even though he already knew most of what she was telling him. It was a ritual they had performed thousands of times, a way of connecting with each other and with the land that had sustained them for so long. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked suddenly. "The life we chose. Sometimes I wonder if you would have been happier in a city with an easier life." Georgia stopped walking and turned to face him, her weathered hands reaching up to cup his face. "Harrison Sloane, I have never regretted a single moment. This life with you in this place has been everything I could have wanted and more. We raised good children. We helped people. We lived on our own terms, using skills and knowledge that most people have forgotten. How could I possibly regret that?" "I just wanted to make sure," he said, covering her hands with his own. "Because I know I asked a lot of you, marrying me and building this life. You did not ask anything of me that I did not freely give, and I would do it all again, exactly the same way without changing a single thing." She stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet. "I love you, Harrison. I have loved you since that first week, when you trusted me enough to follow me into the wilderness, and I will love you until my last breath. And I will love you beyond that," he promised, "into whatever comes next." They walked back to their cabin, their steps slower than they once were but their connection as strong as ever. The garden was flourishing, tended now by Grace and her husband but still laid out according to Georgia's original design. Chickens scratched in the yard, horses grazed in the pasture. Smoke rose from the chimney where a pot of stew simmered, made with vegetables from the garden and herbs from the surrounding wilderness. It was a good life, built on knowledge and love and partnership. Georgia had been the woman who could find food in any forest, who understood the secrets of the land, and used that understanding to survive and thrive. Harrison had been the hungry cowboy who trusted her enough to follow her, who learned from her and loved her and built a life with her that honored both their strengths. Together they had created something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone through the children they had raised and the knowledge they had passed down. They had found abundance where others saw scarcity, love where others saw only hardship, home in a place that many considered wilderness. And every day, for the rest of their long lives, Harrison never went hungry on their journeys because Georgia was always there beside him, finding food in every forest, locating water in every desert, recognizing opportunity in every landscape. But more importantly, he never went hungry for love or companionship or purpose, because she filled his life with all those things and more. They lived to see their grandchildren grow, to watch the world change around them, to witness the slow transformation of the West from wilderness to civilization. But their valley remained largely untouched, a pocket of the old ways preserved by their children and grandchildren who understood the value of what they had built. When Harrison finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, Georgia held his hand and whispered all the things she loved about him, all the memories they had shared, all the gratitude she felt for the life they had built together. And when she followed him 6 months later, her children found her in the garden with dirt under her fingernails and a basket of herbs at her side, a peaceful smile on her face, as though she had simply decided it was time to go. They buried them side by side on a hill overlooking their valley, with a simple marker that read, Harrison and Georgia Sloane, partners in everything. And the land they had loved so well continued to provide for their descendants, generation after generation, a testament to the power of knowledge and love and the extraordinary life that can be built when two people find each other at exactly the right moment and choose to walk forward together into whatever the wilderness offers.